Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I'm delighted to talk to Father Francisco Nahoe. You're most welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to see you. Father Francisco is a Franciscan friar and a Roman Catholic priest. He has degrees from Harvard Divinity School, the University of Nevada, where he earned his PhD, degrees from Dartmouth College and colleges in Rome, where he studied theology and philosophy. Now, he joined the Zaytuna faculty in 2017, where he is assistant professor. Dr. Francisco teaches courses in ethics and politics, and also teaches on Plato, Plutarch, Dante, Shakespeare, and Renaissance literature, which he is passionate about, and so am I. It's remarkable. People are going to want to know, Father, it's remarkable that a Catholic priest is on the faculty of America's leading Muslim college. What's going on there? How does that work educationally?
May I ask a question first?
Please.
Is the audience that follows Blogging Theology already familiar with Zaytuna College?
I think they might well be through people like Dr. Ali Attai, Dr. Abdullah Ali.
Of course, my colleagues.
Your colleagues who are extremely honored guests. So I'm delighted there's a third one now. So, yeah, there is probably some general. I wouldn't say everyone's aware, though.
Well, Zaytuna College is, as far as I am aware, the first fully accredited Muslim liberal arts college in the United States. And it's located in Berkeley, California, immediately adjacent to the University of California, and also sort of nestled into a cluster of theological schools known collectively as the Graduate Theological Union. So it's a consortium of, originally of 5 Protestant schools, a Unitarian school, and 3 Catholic schools. And right, so we're kind of in a cluster of academic theological faculties, as well as in the immediate vicinity of the University of California, Berkeley. So it's a good environment for studies and for scholarship.
Yeah.
And actually, I think Zaytuna College was wise to found itself right there, because it's, there's a certain level of intellectual momentum that translates into, I would say, a strong impact on the student body and on curriculum development at Zaytuna College, just by the fact of being right there in Berkeley and knowing that others' eyes are on you. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. It must be an amazing place just to walk down the road and bump into students or academics. It's hard to get away from it, which is, for some people, that's paradise, mentioning no names. But seriously, how does a Roman Catholic priest end up in a Muslim college? That was the point, really.
Well, as it happens, I had done a period of ministry in the Catholic campus ministry at Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts. It's I think it's the nation's oldest private secondary school, or one of the older ones at any rate. And during that period, we invited Sheikh Hamza Yusuf to speak for the Andover interreligious roundtable, as we called it, weekend. So it was an interfaith study and witness weekend, you might say. And that was when I first got to know him. That was probably in 2005, maybe, or 2004. So Zaytuna Institute, as it was called then, was somewhat on my radar. And years later, when I moved back to the San Francisco Bay Area, I was aware that they had transitioned from having been Zaytuna Institute with a focus primarily on the formation of adult Muslims to Zaytuna College with the intention of founding an undergraduate program. So it was sort of on my radar. And I had at the time, done a tenure of parochial ministry. I had been the rector of the cathedral parish in Reno, Nevada, and during that time had been very close to Nevada Right to Life and other similar organizations. So even though I had moved back to California at that point, I was still sort of unofficially connected to them, and it was the aftermath of the 2016 election cycle in the United States. We had a physician-assisted suicide bill coming before the state legislature in Nevada.
Wow.
And Nevada Right to Life said, well, we want to do a series of roundtable discussions in universities in order to place Right to Life physicians before the university community. And I said to them, if you do that in the aftermath of this election cycle, you are inviting trouble. Because it's hard for people in the aftermath of such an emotional experience to really recalibrate and engage in ways that are not explicitly partisan. So they said to me, well, what should we do then? And I said, well, look, you can't put a Catholic or a Mormon or an evangelical in front of this particular audience at this particular moment. They said, well, whom do we put then? I said, well, why don't you ask a Muslim physician to speak about these issues? And they said, what? I mean,
we weren't expecting you to say that. Yeah.
How on earth, first of all, what do Muslims think about these same biomedical ethics issues that are important to us? And I said, well, my primary experience with these issues among Muslims is Sheikh Hamza, who told us at the end of our Interfaith Roundtable that weekend that if you really want to know the Muslim position in biomedical ethics, find out what Pope John Paul II is saying. And it will be very similar indeed, although informed, of course, by a different Abrahamic tradition. So, it took them a little while to digest what I was saying. And they said, okay, all right, so here's the next question. If we were to ask a Muslim physician, where the heck would we find one?
Yeah.
And I said, well, there's this new Muslim college in Berkeley. I have to be in Berkeley later today. Why don't I stop by and ask?
Gosh.
And it was after December finals, so the autumn semester, I think you call it Michaelmas there, had just ended. And only the dean was in his office when I rang the doorbell in the administrative building, and he answered right away and said, oh yeah, come in, and what are you looking for? And I can give you Dr. Rania's information. And she's was formerly on our faculty and is also a physician at Stanford.
Yes.
So while he was giving me this information, he said, and what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm the mission promoter of the Franciscan Vietnam Mission, which engages me for about 6 months of the year. And the remaining 6 months of the year, I'm meant to be finishing a dissertation. And he said, oh, in what? And I said, Renaissance rhetoric.
Wow.
And he said, oh, well, thank you very much. He gave me the information. And we said our goodbyes. 24 hours later, Zaytuna College offered me a job.
Wow. That's incredible.
And the story I heard, I suppose I should verify this before repeating it, especially under publication. But the story that I heard was that just that day, earlier in a faculty meeting, the president of the college, Sheikh Hamza, had alerted the presidential council that he thought he would not be able to teach the semester of rhetoric in the spring because he had so many speaking engagements being requested of him in the aftermath of the 2016 election cycle, which was brutal for Muslims in the United States. I don't know how closely you might have followed that in the United Kingdom. So he evidently felt that he needed to be more available to the community at large.
Yeah.
And they decided they'd have to start looking around for someone who could teach rhetoric. And apparently the dean called the presidential council, and one of the members of the council said, well, we have to offer him a job. We were just praying that God would send us a rhetoric teacher, and he sent him right into our
and he literally walks in the front door 24 hours ago. Yeah.
But yeah.
Amazing.
So it's really a remarkable set of circumstances that brought me to Zaytuna College at all. And at the end of that semester, I had taught as an adjunct. I think in Britain they might call them a reader, maybe, or
depending on the college. If it's Oxford or Cambridge, it was different from the other universities.
But at the end of that semester, they offered me a full-time position, and so the Franciscans consulted the General Curia in Rome.
I bet they did. Straight to the Vatican with this job request.
and also the Bishop of Oakland, both of whom greenlighted the project immediately.
Wow.
The Bishop of Oakland, himself a Jesuit, was especially welcoming, has been multiple times to our campus since then.
Sorry to interrupt you. Who was Pope, if I could put it this way? Who was Pope at that time? Was it Francis or Benedict at the time? It
would have been Francis in 2016.
Wow. Okay.
So he would have been in his third or beginning the fourth year of his pontificate. And so that's how I ended up on the faculty. And I even spent a year as the interim director of admissions. So if it seems unusual for a Roman Catholic priest to be on the faculty of a Muslim college, how much more unusual, especially to Muslim parents, if their children are interviewing with a Catholic priest. They'll say, well, wait a minute, this is a Muslim college, right?
Yeah. Why is the director of admissions wearing a dog collar and dressed as reverend?
Right.
He doesn't have a beard either. No, I'm only joking. No, that's a delightful story. Thanks for very much sharing that. Perhaps we can turn to more somber matters now, as advertised, about the Pope, the late Pope, Benedict XVI. And just to give a brief introduction to viewers who may not know who he was the head of the Catholic Church and sovereign of the Vatican city-state. The Vatican is a sovereign state, by the way. It's like America. It has the United Nations, it has an ambassador and everything else. Anyway, so he was the head of that from 2005 until his resignation in 2013. Benedict chose to be known as Pope Emeritus upon his resignation, like a retired professor, Professor so-and-so Emeritus. And he retained this title until his death just last month in December 2022. And Benedict is generally known for defending traditional Catholic doctrine, values, and liturgy. And perhaps surprisingly, he was originally a liberal theologian, but adopted quite conservative views after 1968. Quite a significant year, 1968, turned many people to Roger Scruton is a well-known thinker and philosopher in Britain. 68 was a pivotal year for him when he became very conservative. Anyway,
Scruton was in Paris.
Yes, it was the famous student, nearly a revolution in Paris in the 60s, which it had a big effect ultimately in California, of course, in the university campuses there, in Berkeley, and the whole world kind of engulfed, the student world was engulfed in radical activism, but that's another story. Now, during his papacy, Benedict advocated, as I say, a return to fundamental Christian values, but specifically to counter the increased secularization of many Western countries. So just if I can ask you, Father Francisco, to firstly share with us what you understand to be the Pope's significance for the Catholic Church.
Well, if I may, I first like to address the question of whether or not Joseph Ratzinger began as a liberal and migrated into conservatism. And my first concern about this way of describing his intellectual and public development is that it relies too much, I think, on neat binaries, namely liberal and conservative, which come bundled with a host of other political and social issues that I think are not necessarily the best matrix within which to locate the subtlety of his theological commitments. So
Right.
first of all, I want to say that the Ratzinger, the pre-60s Ratzinger that I read.
So just to clarify here, the Ratzinger is what Pope Benedict was before he became Pope. That was his actual real
Joseph
German
Ratzinger
name.
is his baptismal name.
His actual baptized name. He became Pope, he became Benedict. Yeah.
Right, known as Benedict XVI. So I think the first thing that I want to stress is that when I read the pre-60s Ratzinger, I see a tremendous continuity with what he had written and said afterwards, and especially during his papacy. In many respects, I want to say that the papacy is the crystallization of thinking that had already been set in motion when he was a very young scholar indeed, first at Tübingen and then a Peritus in the Second Vatican Council. So I'm not entirely comfortable myself with the idea that we're looking at a Ratzinger who did a significant about face in the way that, for example, Roger Scruton describes his own changes in commitment. On the contrary, I see Ratzinger as radically a whole and continuing to be that way straight through to the end. Now, that said, I think the deeper question is, why do I think that? What do I see in Ratzinger especially that would be continuous threads that are woven into the fabric of his thought? And I'd say really, here's probably the central idea for Ratzinger. And this is something that I became acquainted with when I was 18 years old, if you can imagine. Fresh out of high school, my freshman year in college, I randomly pulled a book off the shelf of the library at the Newman Center at the university where I was studying at the time. And it was a book of Joseph Ratzinger's. And these are the words that I had in mind for this interview to share with your viewers. Ratzinger tells a series of stories drawn from primarily contemporary sources: a French dramatist, the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, modern Jewish Hasidic tales. And he uses all of them to paint a portrait not only of the uncertainty of faith in the modern world, but of the radical uncertainty of doubt in the modern world. And this is what he says. The believer knows himself to be constantly threatened by unbelief, which he must experience as a continual temptation. So too, for the unbeliever, faith remains a temptation and a threat to his apparently permanently closed world. In short, there is no escape from the dilemma of being a man. Anyone who makes up his mind to evade the uncertainty of belief will have to experience the uncertainty of unbelief, which can never finally eliminate for certain the possibility that belief may, after all, be the truth. Now, if we think of this as a core element in Benedict's attitude toward the world changing so radically around him, I think we'll see that what we're looking at is not a thinker who was liberal in the 50s and the early 60s and then conservative in the 70s and the 80s, but rather a world that has spun out of control and is veering uncertainly from one extreme to another. So I guess that's probably the first experience that I've had of Ratzinger. And I have to say too, I began my theological studies in Berkeley, where I teach now, one of the theological faculties that I alluded to earlier, in the mid-1980s.
Gosh.
And it is not an exaggeration to say that even in the Catholic, maybe especially in the Catholic faculties, Ratzinger was the most hated man in the Catholic Church.
Yes. Yes.
So that was hardly a great environment for a guy like me who felt that, Ratzinger was in some respects his papa, at least intellectually. Yeah. Yes. And the first ever, in my mind, to begin that constant rapprochement that every believer in the modern world is compelled to undertake, which is the rapprochement between reason and faith.
Fide e ratio. A ratio, didn't John Paul II write an encyclical called precisely that?
He did. John Paul II cranked out a ton of encyclicals, didn't he?
Yeah, they're great stuff. I mean, Veritatis Splendor is my favorite encyclical ever. And I can't help thinking, and this is digressing, I don't mean to digress, that Pope Francis wouldn't really like it. That's my hunch. But what do I know?
I don't know how to answer that either, but I can say this. One of the first things that Pope John Paul II did was to pluck Joseph Ratzinger out of the Archdiocese of Munich and plunk him down right in the middle of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And Ratzinger...
Sorry, can I follow? Sorry to interrupt. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, for those who don't know, is, and forgive me for characterizing like this, but you've heard all this before, I know, is the modern successor of the Inquisition.
Yes, it is.
Of the Church.
I've actually been examined in the Inquisition, by the way, and I'll have you know I was found wanting.
No, really?
That's a different story. I had to take a Hebrew exam there, and I didn't pass it. So I had to go back later and pass it. But anyway, it's the building is called the Holy Office, and it's the Holy Office of the Inquisition. So I was actually examined by a
Did they torture you? Did they put you on a rack or put hot pokers in your ear or something?
The torture was having to learn all of those Hebrew paradigms.
Well, that's even worse. That's fiendishly cruel, surely.
Right. So, most people, I think, don't really fully appreciate the degree to which Ratzinger vetted, commented upon every single encyclical that John Paul II wrote. Now, I'm not saying that it is not absolutely originally John Paul II's material, but everybody benefits tremendously from the commentary of others. And it's no accident that John Paul II placed Joseph Ratzinger right at his side.
Gosh. If
his career is going to be a career of teaching, as indeed it was, cranking out those encyclicals, who better to have at your side than the most perspicacious theological mind of the era?
Yeah. Exactly.
So I think really, Hans
Kung would probably disagree with you on that. He might privately think Hans Kung, was the most perceptive theologian of that time. So
nobody today reads Hans Kung.
Really?
I haven't met a young Catholic seminarian who is currently reading Hans Kung, and they're only vaguely aware of him. He absolutely doesn't have anything in particular to say to the church at this moment.
Okay.
But I think Ratzinger still does. However much you may not like what he has to say, he still has plenty to say. And so I'm not hostile towards Hans Kung, but he did sort of make a career out of dissent.
He did, but I mention him also because Ratzinger, if I can call him one, I think when he was Pope, actually, Pope Benedict, didn't he meet with Ratzinger in Germany and have a conversation with Hans Kung? I mean, the two, they both embody the opposite wings of the church, I would put it. And they met in Germany, spoke German. They were German academics together, in a way.
Kung is Swiss.
Swiss, you're absolutely right. A German Swiss, German speaking. Anyway, but they met in Germany and apparently had a very amicable conversation. They didn't strangle each other, and so I guess that was good.
I have a funny story about how amicable Pope Benedict was. When I was a seminarian in Rome, it was shortly after the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith issued the monitum, that is to say, the warning, with regard to the works of the liberationist theologian Leonardo Boff, a Brazilian.
Very, very famous liberation.
Right, and I think, I have to say that those two documents on aspects of liberation theology that Ratzinger wrote and that were promulgated under the authority of John Paul II absolutely nail the difficulties with liberation theology. So I recommend that anybody who is interested in the question read them, because they really, in some respects, I would say they saved liberation theology by delimiting the space within which it could legitimately operate. But that said,
sorry, that's the point. I mean, Berkeley, you say Ratzinger was a hate figure, but that was the reason why, I think,
for that. That's why. It's because of those interventions more than anything.
Because of being quite a left-wing environment, shall we say. Ratzinger's critic of Marxist influence liberation theology in South America was, of course, taken very badly by people on the left who are very into activism and social action.
Right. And so Leonardo Boff was sort of the poster child of that issue. Right. And a group of my Franciscan confreres, 11 Brazilian friars, went to the midnight mass at the Vatican. I guess I'd had a cold or something and just decided to stay in bed that night. So I didn't get to see this myself. But they all saw Cardinal Ratzinger after the mass, and they pounced on him, right? And they said, Your Eminence, can we have a picture with you? And I want to say that Cardinal Ratzinger knew, first of all, he said to them, You're Brazilian, aren't you? And they said, Yes, Your Eminence. And he said, All right, come on, let's have a picture. He knew perfectly well
opportunity, isn't it,
that
now?
these Brazilian Franciscans wanted that photograph for the notoriety of it having been Ratzinger. And he said, yeah, what the heck, let's do it. So he was really game, and he was a gentle figure. And I think he had a good sense of humor too. And this is what all the Brazilian friars said after the encounter as well. They said, we understood that he knew what we wanted the photograph for, and he wasn't fussed, and he said, okay, what the heck, let's just do it anyway.
That's a lovely story. But just moving on to a more controversial side, another controversial side. He wasn't popular in Berkeley with the students, but there was Benedict's relations with Muslims were very strained at times. And in 2006, he delivered a lecture which mentioned Islam at the University of Regensburg, if I mispronounced that, in Germany. And Muslims were particularly offended by a passage that the Pope quoted in his speech. And this is the quote. So forgive me, it's offensive, but I'll quote it. Show me just what Muhammad brought that was new, and there you will find things only evil and inhuman, such as his command to spread by the sword the faith he preached. Now, this was a quote from a Christian emperor, a Byzantine emperor, before the sack of Istanbul in the 14th century. But nevertheless, the Pope saw fit to quote it. And Muslim critics said the Pope made a number of historical errors as well. The main one, which I think is a very, very interesting teaching point, this is a mistake, because it is a mistake. I don't think anyone could defend it otherwise. The main mistake he made was, although the Pope had said that Surah 2, verse 256, which states, there is no compulsion in religion, end quote, was an early verse, when Muhammad was powerless in Mecca. This verse was, in fact, one of the last verses to be added to the Quran in Medina at a time when the Muslim state was powerful. So this was an elementary mistake, but it's not like just a technical error. It actually completely changes his argument from, in fact, about Islam at that time. So it's a very significant mistake. So my question to you, and I know perhaps you're not familiar with all the details of that particular lecture at that time, And I know there's a lot more to say about Pope Benedict than just that incident, which did cause a uproar in the Muslim world.
I remember, yes.
And many scholars, Muslim scholars, wrote to him and protested. This is not good for peaceful relations with Muslims, and this is just a mistake you made. But was Pope Benedict, do you think, just badly advised about Islam, or do you think he held a deep animosity towards the religion?
I think he was neither badly advised nor held an animosity toward Islam. I suspect he made the blunder entirely on his own. And the reason I say that is because what little familiarity I have based on biographical descriptions with his scholarly methods is that he produced his material alone.
Oh.
So I think now maybe he ought to have had a Joseph Ratzinger at his side to vet things like that, but he didn't. The subsequent prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith was not, in fact, a theologian of particular note. He was maybe a very competent administrator. So I think it's probably correct to say that Pope Benedict made that blunder entirely on his own. But I think it's also important to underscore that it was a blunder. And I mean, elsewhere in the substantive corpus of his life's production of commentary and of theology, he speaks very approvingly of Islam, and especially of the radical monotheism and the notion of submission that characterizes Islam. So what can I say? I mean, I'm not a Benedictine apologist, and I certainly wasn't on his staff at the time, so I have nothing in particular to defend. But I would say, yeah, the historical errors that are evident in the Regensburg address, I think they are to be attributed to him. But attributing hostility toward Islam toward him, I think, is not correct, because I don't see that elsewhere in his either in his pontificate or in his theological work up to that point. I think one of the interesting characteristics of the Regensburg address, and something that is probably just as uncomfortable for Christians as for Muslims, at least contemporary Christians, what the Regensburg address does more than anything is come down solidly on the on one side of the so-called Euthyphro dilemma, right?
Euthyphro, this is obviously from Plato's dialogue.
Well, I mean, there are multiple forms of this dilemma that are articulated, at least in the West, afterwards. But the basic idea is: do the gods love this because it is pious, or is it pious because the gods love it? And the intellectualist position, which is represented in figures, at least in the West, like Thomas Aquinas, for example, is clearly the position, the side on which Benedict comes down in that particular address. And I think his reasons for doing so were to, I mean, Franciscans were really upset with this address too, because it seemed to marginalize the thought of John Duns Scotus. The English philosopher. And a Franciscan friar, right? Blessed John Duns Scotus, who had been, whose beatitude had been recognized formally by the Universal Church under John Paul II. So, we were kind of thinking, oh, well, pretty soon he's going to be canonized. This will be great, right? And the Franciscan intellectual life is back. That hasn't happened, right? And that has a lot to do with the the Regensburg address. So, but I'd say that's probably, at least insofar as Christianity is concerned, the one of the more significant implications is that the Holy Father in that instance seems to have come down very solidly on the intellectualist side of that particular dilemma.
Gosh, I think it's also just worth stressing for people who may not know what the official teaching of the Roman Catholic Church is regarding Muslims. And I've just got a couple of paragraphs here I just want to share. Obviously, Father, you're very well aware of these passages, but I'm going to just read from the Second Vatican Council. This is what's called an Ecumenical Council that met in the early 1960s. The bishop and the popes, all the universal church, all the bishops in the world met in Rome, in the Vatican, of course, the sovereign state of the Vatican, in a sense, I mean, there's various ways of describing it, but one way is to update the church in terms of its relationship with the world, with religion, other religions, and so on, that hadn't really changed since, the medieval times. But anyway, at the Second Vatican Council, so this teaching that I'm about to read to you about Muslims and Islam, it comes now from the highest authority in the church. So it's not just the opinion of a pope, an opinion of a priest. It's the official teaching of the Roman Catholic Church about Muslims. So I just want to stress that this is, if you hear a Roman Catholic speaking badly about Islam, and unfortunately you do sometimes hear them speak that way, they're not following the teachings of the church. They're following their own whims and desires and prejudices, arguably. And one can say that authoritatively because we know what the church taught. And I have the documents here, the Vatican Council number 2, which contains the documents. So just couple of brief quotations. The first one's from a document, they're all in Latin, by the way, Lumen Gentium, published in 1964. But the plan of salvation, says the Catholic Church, also includes those who acknowledge the Creator. In the first place among them are the Muslims. The first place, Muslims. These Muslims profess to hold the faith of Abraham, and together with us, they adore the one merciful God, mankind's judge on the last day. End quote. That's just one short extract from Lumen Gentium, this authoritative conciliar document. The other one is another document called Nostra Aetate. Aetate, thank you.
Our age means our age.
Our age, exactly. And in English, it says this. Again, this is the highest teaching authority in the Roman Catholic Church. All Muslims, all Christians, actually Catholics, are supposed to agree to this today. The Church has also a high regard for the Muslims. They worship God, who is one, living and subsistent, merciful and almighty, the creator of heaven and earth, who has spoken to men. They mean men and women, I think, by that. They strive to submit themselves without reserve to the hidden decrees of God, just as Abraham submitted himself to God's plan, to whose faith Muslims eagerly link their own. Although not acknowledging him as God, they venerate Jesus as a prophet. His Virgin Mother they also honor, and even at times devoutly invoke. We're not going to go there, by the way, on that last clause, as a controversial thing to say. Further, it continues, they await the day of judgment and the reward of God following the resurrection of the dead. For this reason, they highly esteem an upright life and worship God, especially by way of prayer, alms, and fasting. End quote. Now, that's an extraordinary statement for the Roman Catholic Church to make, historically considered. If you look at what the Church, the Crusades, of course, and the papal endorsement of invasions of Muslim lands and so on, we're not going to go there either. But I don't mean to bring up that in a negative way. I'm just saying that the progress that has been made in the Church in understanding and tolerance and respect, even though an acknowledgement of differences, of course, is extraordinary, and one of the great fruits, I would argue, of the Second Vatican Council. And of course, Ratzinger endorsed very much all his life the Second Vatican Council.
He was one of the periti, one of the theological experts who were charged with drafting these documents.
Right. Well, there we go. So, this has to the speech he gave in Germany, which we've already mentioned, needs to be seen perhaps in this larger context of in terms of his legacy, hopefully, as one of the participants in the Second Vatican Council, which produced these extraordinary documents, which I've just quoted from. Do you have anything to add to that at all, Father?
Well, I think that I basically have just two things to say. Firstly, the what we consider the novelty of a Catholic priest being on the faculty of a Muslim college in the United States is due in no small part to that document.
Wow.
Now, I say in no small part. I think there are other historical considerations to be made, and that's simply this. St. Francis of Assisi antedates Nostra Aetate by 800 years.
Yeah, what's the story about Francis, and what did he do? That says I'm aware of the story. He did something remarkable, didn't he, for his time?
He according to the hagiographers, he crossed the battle lines at Damietta during the Fifth Crusade and entered into a colloquium with the Ayyubid Sultan Malik al-Kamil. And I think, unfortunately, we only really have European hagiographical accounts of this event. We don't have any Ayyubid accounts of this event. I think that would be fantastic. I've actually consulted with my colleagues on the question of, what degree of speculation are we capable of that would answer the question, why would Malik al-Kamil listen to someone like St. Francis of Assisi, and why would he why would such praise of the saint be attributed to him? In other words, can we make an attempt to read this event through an explicitly Muslim lens? And I think if we were to do that, we'd find that both Christianity and Islam have always had a degree of radical openness to one another that has existed, unfortunately, side by side with the competition and the warfare. But it is the task, nonetheless, of the intelligent believer who is committed both on the Christian and on the Muslim sides of the question to explore the relationship in greater depth. And I think that there's a sense in which Nostra Aetate is attempting to say definitively, to capture definitively this less well-known aspect of Muslim-Christian relations that nonetheless reaches deep into the history of both.
Okay, fascinating. My last question, if I may, to you, another controversial one, but not perhaps as harrowing as the other one.
What the heck? I mean, at this point.
you just anything. Why has Pope Francis, obviously the successor of Benedict, why has Pope Francis apparently sought to undo the conservative liturgical reforms of his predecessor? And I read recently in the UK Catholic Herald newspaper, which reported, and I quote, "New curbs on the traditional Latin Mass broke Pope Benedict's heart, according to his private secretary," end quote. His private secretary wasn't just some secretary; he is an archbishop, no less.
Yeah. Georg Franz Fein, I think, is
Yes.
the one whom we're talking about.
Absolutely. This has hurt a lot of people here in the UK. I try and follow the Catholic press in the UK and in the States, and a lot of Catholics, and I think a lot of bishops here, I suspect, would sympathise, feel hurt at the apparently brutal way that their traditional appreciation of the Latin Mass has been curtailed and made difficult by the Pope in his recent decisions. And this, we now know after Benedict's death, very sad that this broke Pope Benedict's heart. And you can imagine the two popes in the Vatican, one emeritus and the other non-emeritus, one having his heart broken by what the other just around the corner was doing. And it's just a very tragic and sad account. And does Francis know? I mean, I know that there's a reasons why he did it. I'm not that naive to think he was just being vicious. He wasn't. There's a political reasons, strategic reasons, ecclesiastical reasons why he wanted to put these guys in their place. You know, some of them are schismatic, some of them were anti-Vatican II, a lot of them, all of them, probably anti-Francis. I mean, not officially, of course, because he's the Pope, but you know what they're thinking under the surface. So he really wanted to kind of rein them in, perhaps, but it's caused a lot of heartache, which is well known here. And I mean, what's going on there? I mean, is this, you know, the Francis is supposed to be the inclusive, the welcoming, the, you know, breaking down barriers, and you know, to LGBT people particularly, but others, the poor, and so on. When it comes to the traditional people in his own church, he doesn't seem to like them very much, and that's extraordinary.
I don't know what to say. I mean, as far as apparently I'm not on his speed dial, so I didn't get a chance to offer my opinion before Traditiones Custodes was promulgated. I can say that I do myself celebrate the traditional Latin Mass.
Gosh.
Regularly, not to the exclusion of the Novus Ordo. I still have, of course, public commitments in both. At least in the majority of the dioceses of the United States, the situation hasn't changed that much.
Oh, really? Okay.
Since Traditiones Custodes has been promulgated. I don't really know what to say. I can't read Pope Francis's mind. I can say this though, at the moment of his election in 2013, the Italian bishops asked him to rescind Summorum Pontificum, which was the motu proprio from Benedict XVI that permitted the unencumbered celebration of the traditional Latin Mass by any priest whatsoever.
Yeah.
And he refused to do it.
Interesting.
And he apparently was persuaded in 2021, was it? I guess just a year ago. So, it was a year ago in July, so 2020 it must have been. But that's, 7 years of having been asked repeatedly by various bishops from elsewhere in the world to rescind it. Now, it should be, I think, specified that although Pope Francis did, in fact, rescind the motu proprio, he hasn't rescinded the celebration of the traditional Latin Mass. And although there may well be restrictions in some places, there are next to no restrictions in other places. What Traditiones Custodes did was to return the discretion about the celebration of the traditional Latin Mass to the local ordinary.
Which means the local bishop, by the way.
Right, which means the local bishop.
Yeah.
So in some respects, this is actually how can I put this? Pope Benedict gave that discretion to priests at large. Pope Francis now requires priests at large to be in dialogue with their bishops.
But some will say...
If I had to say which of those two is the more conservative, I think I'd say Francis has actually given us a more conservative set of procedures to follow, in the sense that the priest has to be in dialogue with his bishop in order to be able to celebrate that Mass.
But the problem is that there are many bishops. I mean, you know better than I. Who am I to say? But I get the impression there are many bishops who are quite hostile to the Latin Mass in their diocese, and so wouldn't give permission. So in those dioceses,
I think Dr. Seuss put it best. They do not like it in a boat. They do not like it with a goat. They do not like it here or there. They do not like it anywhere.
Dr. Seuss.
That's all I can say. I mean, I can be impatient with such bishops, but I'm not a bishop, and I'm not. More importantly, I'm not the Bishop of Rome, so I don't get to make these decisions. But I do believe that those of us who are deeply attached to the traditional Latin Mass, who have either discovered in it or rediscovered through it a particularly apt response to the glaring secularity of the world in which we are immersed, and who are therefore heartbroken, I guess is the word that Ganswein used, at the restrictions that have been imposed on it, need simply to consider that God has permitted this. God turned the vessels of the temple over to Nebuchadnezzar, and he did it for the good of Israel. Right. If these restrictions are for the good of the Catholic Church, who are we to object? And we can't not say, oh, but they're not for the good of the Catholic Church. Because that's what it means that we have a pope who is competent to make these kinds of disciplinary decisions. So I think those of us who love the tradition are in a position where we really have to, as the saying goes, put our money where our mouth is. And
we're going to be a Catholic, obey the Pope. That's the whole thing. Part of being a Catholic, sorry to be simplistic and caricature, is that you follow the Pope. You know, if you're not going to do that, then
he is the visible sign of unity, right? And Saint Francis of Assisi, for what it's worth, said, "You will obey the Lord Pope." He didn't say you will like him. He didn't say you will obsequiously fawn over every word he says. He says you will obey him. These are the instructions that he gave to the friars. So I may not be happy with this, but I cannot help but believe that if we commit ourselves wholly to the will of God, he will bring us through this, and it will be much better for us than if we were doing it some other way. So I wait in hope, and I encourage others who love the traditional Latin Mass as I do, and especially priests who celebrate it, to continue in hope. We do not yet know what God has in store for us.
And also, I didn't realize you celebrated the Latin Mass and frequently. So not only are you
frequently, mostly actually, I probably celebrate once or twice in the Novus Ordo in the course of a week. But it is also to be said that I have a tremendous commitment to vernacular Mass. I've taken the trouble to learn how to celebrate the Holy Sacrifice in multiple vernaculars, so as to be able to bring the sacraments in places that will sometimes otherwise be marginalized. That's partly why I'm here in Polynesia right now.
You're in Tahiti, aren't you?
I happen to be in Tahiti at the moment, but I am just back from a stint in the outer islands, in the Tuamotu archipelago, where there are no residential priests. Right. And so it's important to be able to go there and to engage people sacramentally in the language that draws them closest to God. So I have tremendous commitments on both sides of this equation, and
remarkably diverse. I'm still coming to terms with the idea of a Roman Catholic priest teaching at a Muslim college, and now you're telling me that the most of the time you celebrate Mass, it's in Latin, which the Latin Mass is a very traditionalist thing. So it kind of even makes it even more kind of not exotic but unusual, shall we say?
Right, Father Unusual.
Father Unusual. That's
what they'll call me.
Oh, did they? Yeah, it's an extraordinary juxtaposition of roles.
So I was recently in Ireland, by the way.
Okay. And Tahiti, Ireland, America.
Well, the Renaissance Society of America was doing its annual conference after several prorogations on account of COVID, and I was presenting a paper, so I had occasion to be there. Right. And I spent some time at a traditional monastery where only the Latin Mass is celebrated. And basically, all I did was send my credentials to the bishop and ask for permission to go there and to celebrate the traditional Latin Mass while I was there. And he said yes.
Right.
So maybe if it were a different bishop in a different location, he would have said no.
Yeah.
But all I can say is that the kingdom of God is not a matter of me having whatever I want whenever I want it. That's the kingdom of McDonald's.
You're going to write these things down. That's very, very witty. The kingdom of McDonald's. What a horrible thought.
We do have the tendency in modernity to think in terms of
entitlement.
Yeah. Because I, in every other aspect of my life, I can basically have whatever I want. At least those of us who live in the first world.
You live in California, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is true. Maybe not everywhere else. But I hadn't mentioned to you I was going to ask this question, but it's just a final supplementary question. It just occurred to me. After John Paul II died, there was clearly a movement to have him declared a saint, to be canonized. Do you think that's going to happen with Ratzinger, with Benedict XVI?
Again, I'm not on anybody's speed dial as far as I can tell.
Do you sense, though, that there's a movement to do that, or is it just not going? I mean, because there was that movement.
I don't think there's. I think there already would be chatter about it.
Yeah,
if it was something that. I mean, the big issues to resolve with regard to our thinking about Benedict XVI is, what does it mean that he abdicated the pontificate?
That's true.
So I think it'll take quite a bit of time. So all I can say is the last pope who abdicated was canonized.
Right. Oh, he was. Oh, I think it was something else. Oh, I didn't realize that.
Celestine V, even though some people claim that he's the great refuser whom Dante places in the Inferno, nonetheless, the Universal Church recognizes him as a saint. But I still think that was the product of quite a lot of time for reflection, and I suspect that Ratzinger, one way or the other, will also need to be the product of quite a bit more time. We're not the Catholic Church these days, at least as far as I can tell, is not particularly in a reflective mood. We don't exactly reflect. No, not like once. We tend to be swept away in one direction or another, just like everybody else. I'm sorry to say.
Yes.
But hopefully, the day will come when we're in a more of a frame of mind to reflect about things like this. And it can wait. It's not the kind of thing that needs to be resolved immediately.
No, indeed. Oftentimes it was centuries before people were declared saints.
Exactly.
Not 5 minutes after they died.
The real issue is not whether Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, will become a saint. But the real question is, by the grace of God, may I become a saint? That is to say, may I live a holy life and so be happy with God in the world to come? This is the more important issue, right?
Okay,
for each one of us.
Spoken like a pastor, yes, indeed. I just want to say I read this book by Pope Benedict XVI, Jesus of Nazareth. It's got both names. The top has got Joseph Ratzinger and then Pope Benedict the 16th. It's great reviews. I mean, one of the reasons I appreciated this book was because it really showcases Ratzinger as a scholar of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the historical Jesus. He engages with the latest German scholarship, academic scholarship, very, very well. The positions he takes are very traditional, conservative positions, say on authorship of the Gospels, the historicity of this and that, without going into the details. But nevertheless, even though he comes to the inevitable conclusions, perhaps, that he upholds the tradition of the Church, he does so engaging with the critical issues, and in a way that I wasn't aware that John Paul II ever did, or Francis has done. I mean, they're not academics like that, like Ratzinger was. So you can't.
John Paul II sort of was, yeah. I mean, he had two doctorates, right?
A biblical scholar. I mean, as a New Testament scholar, specifically.
No, he wasn't. He didn't have any pretensions towards.
No. That's yeah. He was a scholar in other things, of course. I meant in this particular area. So this book's been very popular with Catholics and Christians in general, actually, and so I wanted to get to see what he was saying about it. I must say, I wasn't persuaded by, I wasn't compelled by a lot of his arguments, but who cares? That's not what matters. But just to say that he is someone who's taken seriously academically, outside of the confines of the academia in the books he's written. And this is a part of a series of books on Jesus. This is just one of them, and they were very, very readable. Actually, he wasn't boring for a German scholar. That's pretty unusual. So
he is very readable. His prose is very accessible, and yes. This is something that I try to instill in my students at Zaytuna College, that we want to be able to take complex theological ideas and speak of them simply and directly, so that they can be accessible, and their compulsion comes from within, not from a great barrage of words.
Gosh, that's a very interesting thing to say. Well, that's we'll conclude it there. I do thank you very much, Father Francisco, who is in Tahiti at the moment, when he's not in Ireland or California or goodness knows.
I mean, I'm an ethnic Polynesian, so my cousin is a priest here in the Archdiocese of Papeete, and he asked me if I could come to help him during the Christmas feasts. So that's what brought me here. And
I've had the huge pleasure and privilege of interviewing a number of your colleagues at Zaytuna, Professor Abdullah Ali and Professor Ali Attai, and Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. Inshallah, will be coming on Blogging Theology in a month or two. The date is yet to be fixed, but he's committed himself to coming on, and a huge expectations for that, and very much looking forward to what he has to say. And you have a new English philosopher who's just...
Indeed, we do, yes.
And he's from Cambridge, and I'm in touch with, and he's just packing up from Cambridge now, where he was at the university to join you as a philosopher at Zaytuna. So, and he was also on Blogging Theology talking about Kant and all sorts of amazing things. So,
fantastic! Hassan Spiker.
Yes, Hassan Spiker, and he's actually, I mean, to be crude, he's a white English Muslim, but he's not a convert. I mean, he comes from, I think, a second or third generation Muslim family. So an extraordinary thing. But he has a sparkling intellect, and it's an absolute pleasure to talk to, as are the other guests, I hasten to add. But you've got a special bunch of colleagues there at Zaytuna, I must say.
We're very blessed.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your time. Until next time.
You're welcome.